but it also reflects obstacles in the labor and financial markets. And so the Black-white wealth gap in particular can be attributed to a history of discriminatory policies such as redlining. And importantly, this legacy continues to replicate itself generation to generation, as those without accumulated wealth cannot pass it on to their children. The second part of why I believe it's important is that these differences are consequential. So wealth is protective and is important for well-being. So increased wealth has been associated with better health outcomes and better financial resilience. And during this pandemic, what we've seen is that those with greater wealth had more resources to fall upon when the economy slowed. So it provides a kind of self-insurance against economic adversity. It also provides access to housing in safe neighborhoods with good schools, which confers additional advantages on those who can afford such opportunities. And so closing the wealth gap is not about trying to literally take away, but is trying to ensure that everybody can participate in this economy.
Yeah, well, that's powerfully important. Thank you. And you know, one big contributor to the wealth gap is student loan debt. Black and Latinx students borrow more money to go to college and they have a harder time paying it off. If the president canceled up to $50,000 in student loan debt, as Leader Schumer and I have called for, it would close the racial wealth gap among people with student loan debt by about 25 points. Canceling $50,000 in federal student loan debt is the single biggest thing the administration could do on its own to narrow the racial wealth gap. So I hope we'll get a chance to work together to make this happen. I want to turn to another piece of the racial wealth gap, and that is home ownership. Owning a home is the #1 way that middle-class families build wealth. But here's the ugly truth. The racial home ownership gap is now wider than it was when Congress outlawed housing discrimination back in the mid-1960s. And this difference can be traced directly to decades of racist federal policies, including redlining that denied Black families the same path to home ownership that was available to white families. Since the government created this problem, it seems only right that the government should help fix it. So Congresswoman Fudge, you've spent your career working to improve the lives of people in communities of color. If the federal government provided help with down payment for families living in formerly redline neighborhoods, would that make a difference in narrowing the racial homeownership gap and the racial wealth gap?
Thank you very much, Senator. It would make a huge difference because that is the biggest impediment to home ownership for communities of color, is the down payment. We meet all of the other qualifications. And so it's like us being in a race with people who've already had a head start because we don't have a mother or father to give us a down payment. We don't have the wherewithal, the same kind of income, the same kind of access. And so it is like we are starting out of the blocks with somebody who was out ahead of us by 100 yards. Down payment assistance is a major impediment. And if we can fix that, you would see a tremendous growth because no matter what they say, home ownership amongst Blacks right now is the same as it was in 1968.
Yep. So thank you, Congresswoman. You're very powerful on this. We need to take action before the pandemic widens the homeownership gap even more. You know, it's time for an all-hands-on-deck approach to tackling the shameful racial disparities in our economy. Providing down payment assistance is one powerful way to do that. Administratively canceling billions of dollars of student loan debt is another. I know you both care deeply about these issues, and I'm looking forward to working with you in your new roles. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Warren. Senator Schatz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member. Thank you to our nominees. I want to start with Congresswoman Fudge. We had a great conversation the other day, and I wanted to follow up on something I feel very passionately about. A straight line can be drawn from the racist local, state, and federal segregation policies of the past to our zoning codes today. And so in addition to recommending recommitting to fair housing enforcement, what should HUD do to encourage communities to abandon exclusionary zoning and implement policies that build accessible, equitable, and affordable housing?
Well, thank you, Senator, and I did very much enjoy our conversation. We have to get rid of this notion of not in my backyard. We're going to have to find ways for two reasons. One is housing has increased by 10% or more a year. And the average person that we're talking about that HUD serves are people who are not, their incomes are not rising at that level. So we're going to have to find some incentives for home builders, especially those that build multifamily housing, to assist us in these communities to change the zoning laws. I mean, some of these are very, very discriminatory, and I think that there are some legal options, but I also think we need to convince them that it is to their advantage economically. It is to their advantage to make sure that their communities know that it is important to them to get people off the street and to house people properly in safe, affordable neighborhoods. Zoning is a tough issue. Being a mayor, I understand it, but it is an educational issue, and we need to make sure that we educate them on what they are doing to their communities.
Well, thank you for that. And I'm looking forward to working with you on this. And I'll just add that part of this is the politics of cities and towns, and people who otherwise consider themselves rather progressive get rather regressive, and are not reminded by people such as you and many of the people on the banking committee and in the Congress that the exclusionary zoning, restrictive covenants, all of that is the great grandson of Jim Crow. And we need to remember that legacy, even as all of these progressives were fighting for progressive causes, except for housing next to their block. And that's something that we have to wrap our minds around, not just from a policy perspective, but from a community and communications perspective. And I'm hoping that we can work together on that.
So if I'm confirmed, I will be talking with you about it all the time, Senator.
Great. Last Congress, I introduced a Cdbg DR reform bill that would permanently authorize the program and get funding to communities faster to help communities develop housing-focused community resilience plans. Do you support the permanent authorization of Cdbg DR?
Yes, very, very much. And I will be happy, if confirmed, to work with you on it. That's the only way we can get it out without jumping through a million hoops.
Thank you very much. And Hawaii has one of the worst housing shortages in the United States. We have San Francisco, New York prices and Midwestern salaries. And so do I have your commitment to work, generally speaking, on the housing shortage in Hawaii, and specifically on the Native Hawaiian housing challenge and the Native Hawaiian housing block grant?
Very much. I'm looking forward to working with you.
Okay, and Dr. Rouse, there's a real sort of shift in thinking around the economics of climate action. And I think that this thinking is happening in academia. It's certainly happening in markets, as we see, and it's happening in the Congress. And I'm wondering how you see your role in developing the data sets that sort of flesh out the case that climate action is not just not in conflict with an economic strategy, but it is in fact our economic strategy. And I'm wondering how you're going to develop the data sets to clarify that, so we don't have to have this sort of 1970s argument about whether we're going to protect the environment or develop the economy.
Senator, I can assure you that the addressing our climate challenge is front and center of the administration's agenda and of the CEA. First and foremost, we will have an economist, one of our members, and we're hiring another economist, should I be confirmed at least, that will focus on climate and understanding the true costs of climate inaction, understanding the benefits of addressing climate and how we can do so efficiently are key to what I'd like to accomplish at the CEA, should I be confirmed.
Thank you, Senator Schatz. Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you. Congratulations on the nominations, both to you, Congresswoman Fudge and Dr. Rouse. Dr. Rouse, let me start with you. And I appreciate both of you having conversations with me. But Dr. Rouse, let me start with you. And as you can imagine, it's surrounding the hospitality industry and tourism industry because Nevada has been so hard hit. Our resort operators support our whole community But as you and I discussed, when people are unwilling to travel during a pandemic, it has a devastating impact on our economy, both on the businesses and the workers that directly and indirectly support it. And let me just throw out some numbers here because I think it's important for us to understand. Before the pandemic, the travel and tourism industry was one of the largest sectors of the economy. In 2019, travel generated 1.1 trillion in spending and supported 15.8 million American jobs. But we know because of the COVID pandemic, it has devastated this industry. And according to Oxford Economics, the US lost 510 billion in travel spending and 4.5 million travel jobs in 2020. So my question to you is, do you think that the industry, the hospitality, the travel, leisure industry is one area where Congress and the administration should focus when crafting a stimulus bill?
Senator, I appreciated our conversation and I share your concern about the travel and leisure industries. We know from the most recent job report that that is an area where we're seeing our most significant job losses and where they have been hardest hit by this pandemic. And as I have said before, getting through this pandemic where as safely as possible, where we're helping individuals, helping the businesses that are viable get to the other side so that they can participate in the growth is very important. And I believe we should be targeting our assistance at those hardest hit areas. I believe the president shares that priority. I would say that in the rescue plan, right, there is additional aid for businesses, but I would look forward to talking with you and understanding what, from your perspective and your constituents' perspective, would be the most effective ways to ensure that we get the assistance to those businesses and those sectors that are the most heavily impacted by the pandemic.
Thank you, Dr. Rouse, because I do look forward to working with you. Senator Kramer and I both introduced this bipartisan bill, the Hospitality and Commerce Job Recovery Act. And we have ideas after working with our industry locally and nationally about what can be done. That includes tax credits to be effective tools to incentivize spending and help certain sectors recover from an economic crisis. So I look forward to talking with you on that subject. Thank you. Congresswoman Fudge, let me associate myself with some of the comments that Senator Scott brought forward with respect to manufactured housing. He and I both co-chaired a bill, the Manufactured Housing Modernization Act. It was passed into law. It was passed into law a year ago, and to my understanding, has still not been implemented by HUD. As a result of that, he and I sent a letter to then Secretary Carson, February 4th, asking for the quick implementation of the new law. And really what it does is it issues guidance for the inclusion of manufactured housing in states and local governments' consolidated plans. So I would look forward to working with you in the implementation of that particular law. But I only have so much time. Let me talk about one other area that we all have been addressing, which is the affordable housing crisis in Nevada, across the country. It is so prevalent. One area, though, is youth homelessness. Nevada's third in the nation for the total number of unaccompanied youth experiencing homelessness and the highest rate of unsheltered, unaccompanied homeless youth. So, and I know this is an area that is important for you as well. What ideas do you have to work with other agencies to reduce the youth homelessness, and what can HUD be doing as well?
Thank you very much, Senator. And I did enjoy a conversation. Thank you. Certainly, if I'm confirmed, one of the things that we need to address right away is youth who are aging out of the foster care system. As soon as they age out, they have no place to go. So HUD has to start to put in place programs to allow them to stay in public housing, at least until we can get them on their feet. But right now, it is a very difficult situation with the numbers of young people who are, as you say, unattended, but the majority of them are foster children. So we need a program for foster youth, and it's something that I would be happy to work with you on, should I be confirmed.
I look forward to it. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cortez Masto. Senator Smith.
Well, Well, thank you so much, Chair Toomey and Chair-to-be Brown, and welcome to our nominees. You both bring such distinguished records and I know a true spirit of public service. So I'm really grateful for the conversations that I was able to have with both of you over the last couple of weeks, and I very much look forward to supporting you. You know, we are in the midst of the worst public health crisis and economic crisis together colliding in our country that we have, in my knowledge, ever lived through. But I really appreciate how both of you are talking about how we need to navigate through this crisis, but also focus on how we can expand on the ingenuity and the innovation and the amazing work of American workers to be able to build our economy forward. I want to just, Dr. Rouse, I want to start with you. I really appreciated our conversation and your thoughtfulness and your reasonableness. And I appreciate especially how you talk about following the data, not just the averages, but the entire scope of data that will help us understand how people are doing at the extremes of our economy, as well as how people on the average are doing. And this gets to a question that Senator Warren was raising that I think is so important. It is the cost of inequality to our economy. And Elizabeth touched on this with regard to home ownership, but I want to ask you about the challenges to our economy because of lack of access to capital for communities of color, Black and Brown and Indigenous communities, and especially the role that CDFIs and native CDFIs can play in expanding access to capital, the impact that can have on inequality and getting our economy really moving again.
Thank you, Senator. You're raising a very important issue as we think about having a shared recovery and bringing ensuring that it's not just the average that does well, but everywhere, and the diversity. It's not. I want to just emphasize that geographic diversity and what happens in our rural areas in particular, and for our hardest hit areas, is an important part of that mosaic. And we know that stimulating economic activity is the best way to generate employment for rural areas, and therefore economic security and livelihood, and to ensure that the young people want to stay in those areas, not that people have to be forced to stay where they don't want to stay, but that they have an incentive to stay and not to flee to urban areas in order to find a job. So if we want to bring back vibrancy to all of the areas of the US, we have to ensure that the businesses and the smaller businesses have access to capital so they can get started. And importantly, during a downturn such as this, that they have access to capital so they can thrive during an economic activity and bridge to make sure that they ensure and they survive to the other side. So I believe this is an important part of our strategy.
I appreciate that. And when you and I met, we talked about what this could look like in Indian country in the United States. And I want to re-extend my invitation to have you come to Minnesota, either virtually or in person, so that we can have some conversations about what that would mean in terms of access to capital and economic development in tribal lands. And let me turn to Representative Fudge just to carry on this theme. I so appreciate you and your leadership. And I also just want to note that as a mayor, I think that mayors know a little bit about mayors. No problem is too big or too small for a mayor to focus on. And also, most problems when you're a mayor are not Republican or Democratic problems. They're problems about whether people's lives work or not. I believe that you'll bring that same spirit to housing and urban development. So I want to thank you. And I want to follow up specifically on a conversation that you and I also had about the shortage of housing on tribal lands. And would ask if you could just comment briefly on HUD, which is the most important housing program for tribal and tribal land, Indian country, and what role you see that can play in addressing the housing shortage in tribal communities.
Well, thank you very, very much. And thank you for taking the time to speak with me. The HUD is something that was brought up to me by most of the Native American stakeholders that I've already spoken with. It's something that I have guaranteed them that I am going to look into as quickly as possible. And as soon as I can, if I'm confirmed, as soon as I can get in the office and talk to the staff and figure out what's going on with it, I promise that I'll get back with you, as well as I promised them that I'd get back with them, and I intend to do just that.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Chair, I have a question for the record, which I will submit for Representative Fudge about the importance of maintenance and safety needs in public housing. This relates to the tragedy in Minnesota with terrible fire and the lack of sprinkler systems. You can get back to me on that, Representative Fudge.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Smith. It's my understanding that Senator Van Hollen may be attempting to log on, but he has not been able to do so yet. Senator Brown, if you had a closing comment you wanted to make, maybe you could make that statement now, and we could give a little bit more time for Senator Van Hollen to join us in case he's able to do so.
I would. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again to my friend Congresswoman Fudge and Dr. Rouse. Thank you. Let me say in response to the questions from a number of my colleagues, it's pretty tough to take to Congresswoman Fudge. It's pretty tough to take a lecture on political speech from members of a party whose leader just 3 weeks ago literally incited a violent insurrection with his words. The real rhetoric we should be worried about are the lies and the conspiracy theories that do more than hurt feelings. They incite violence, they undermine our democracy. I know Senator Toomey at least has pushed back against the former president's dangerous lies about our election. I appreciate his candor and his courage. I wish others of our colleagues on this committee and in the Senate would show the same kind of courage. Thanks to Congresswoman Fudge. Thanks to Dean Rouse, Dr. Rouse, for your thoughtful answers. I'm excited to work with you. This committee made me even more excited about assuming the chairmanship. This hearing today made me even more excited about assuming the chairmanship of this committee. I appreciated Congresswoman Fudge's comments that these are extraordinary times that require extraordinary action. What you two will do in the next several years will be I would assume will be the most important things you've ever done in your lives. I consider my job to be that in the few years ahead. Your service to our country is both admirable and absolutely crucial. So thank you, Chairman Toomey, and thanks to our two witnesses.
Thank you, Senator Brown. Let me just briefly observe, I appreciate the conversation today. I'm grateful to the two witnesses for their willingness to serve our country. I will say, I think I heard bipartisan discussion about the fact that we are in a different place in our economy today than we were back in March. And today, we've got people who are certainly suffering from very terrible circumstances, but it is a much more targeted group of folks than the sort of universal catastrophe we faced in March. And so I hope that as we develop further responses, it will reflect that reality. So this concludes the question and answer portion of today's hearing. Prior to adjourning, I do have some final housekeeping announcements. Before I do that, again, let me thank both of our witnesses, our nominees, for your testimony and for your willingness to serve. For senators, all follow-on questions for the record must be submitted by 5 p.m. Saturday, January 30th. That is 5 p.m. Saturday, January 30th. And for our witnesses, I do ask you to respond to written questions that you receive by noon, Monday, February the 1st. I know that is a very tight time frame, but your prompt responses will facilitate this committee quickly processing your nominations. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.